If this film indeed corresponds with Vereshchagin's story, what we are looking at is the scene of the crash site in Pereyaslawski as viewed by a camera on top of a military truck. The focal point of this scene is here, and indeed appears to be a disc embedded in the ground. Here we see soldiers exiting the truck, led by a captain. The troops are met by another officer, this one a major, and then they join other soldiers and officers already on the scene. This footage is one of 4 reels of film acquired during our investigation. This reel contains images of what appears to be a scientific or medical examination of organic body parts. The individuals seen here appear to be forensic pathologists or biological research scientists. Speaking in Russian, they are seen inspecting the specimen, the leader of the procedure describing his actions and the measurements they are taking. After several minutes of this, there is a change in camera angles. Now we see the specimen being more extensively examined.
Придерживайте инструмент. Ткани разрезаются тяжело. Пробуем кусачки. Придерживайте. Ребра пытаюсь перекусить. Так, нож.
Tools are used to cut open what the leader constantly refers to as tissue.
Что-то белое попадает. Очень ригидные ткани. Давайте попробуем другим. Придерживайте. Выгните, оттяните вот этот вот лоскут. Инструмент. Нет, пинцет.
He also describes parts that are removed as resembling various organs.
Записывайте, достаем внутренние органы, надрезаем похожую на клетчатку внутреннюю ткань.
The camera angle changes again. And finally, the scientists are seen posing for the camera, holding up various samples of the dissection. If this footage is authentic, it represents one of the greatest scientific discoveries of all time. One must wonder where this film was shot and what happened to the specimen seen. If this is footage of a genuine scientific examination, what happened to the results? What did the Soviets learn, and what have they done with that knowledge? Did agents of the KGB have reason to keep this secret for so many years? Certainly there are more questions here than answers. This film footage certainly seems to depict interest by Russian military personnel in the object that is seen sticking out of the ground. Soldiers, officers, and civilian-clothed agents are deployed around the site, and they appear to be both guarding and examining the object. This is what we found on one of the 4 reels of film obtained in Russia. After viewing the footage, we were able to determine that it was most likely shot with 2 separate cameras. One apparently a handheld camera, which starts out on the approaching truck, and a second one seen here on a tripod. As the soldiers march past, you can see the cameraman turn to follow the troops. Here we cut to the other angle, the point of view from the tripod camera. And here you see the handheld camera as the truck pulls up. Both cameras change vantage points several times during the filming, as if to get better views or perhaps under orders of a superior. From this angle, we see yet more troops arrive. Author Veniamin Vereshchagin describes the event.
Весной же 1969 года рабочие местного совхоза
In the spring of 1969, a collective farmer found some strange remains in the forest not far from Berezovsky
и сообщил об этом
and reported that to the local security organs,
те, в свою очередь,
who in their turn
обратились
asked the
за
neighboring
помощью
military
в
division
соседнюю
of air
военную
defense
часть
troops, PVO,
ПВО.
to provide assistance with the
7
investigation.
марта
On March
два офицера
1969, two KGB
осмотрели
officers
это
examined
место.
the discovery site and sealed it off.
Вы знаете, в дальнейшем события приняли более такой масштабный характер. По просьбе КГБ были привлечены
On the KGB request, a Soviet army unit was brought to the discovery site,
и в результате уже очень тщательных обследований были найдены
After close examination of the place, they found some wreckage debris of a disc-shaped object
частично.
partially sunken to the ground.
Поначалу органы безопасности предполагали,
At first, the KGB thought that the debris
американскому разведывательному самолету или
came from an American spying plane or a Soviet spaceship.
George Filer, a retired Air Force intelligence officer who was stationed at Langley, is not surprised the Russians were so interested in this object.
We found that the Soviets would pay to get information on UFOs as opposed to, we'll say, an F-111 aircraft, that they were, in a way, more interested in UFOs than some of our latest aircraft.
And here you see the man who is probably the head KGB agent, directing the cameraman to point his camera toward the disc. A total of almost 1,200 feet of negative were recovered just on this crash site. It is possible that more film was shot, but this is all that we were able to obtain. None of this film depicts the removal of the disc itself, and at no point do we see inside the object. From this angle, we do see the handheld camera shooting behind or inside the disc. However, that footage, if it was, in fact, ever shot, was not included in the cans of film we acquired. We can only speculate that it may still be at large. We must also speculate on how the object ended up here. Based on information from Vereshchagin's book and what we can see in this footage, we have created this computer-animated version of how researchers believe the crash may have occurred. The questions then become, where did this object come from and how did it come to crash here? And more importantly, what has happened to it since? Coming up next,
$10,000 US. These documents better be real.
when we return right after this. And still managed to brutally stomp out his opposition. While the USSR was allied with the West during World War II, the years after the war ushered in an era of mistrust that came to be known as the Cold War. This new relationship chilled ever further in August of 1949, when the Soviets exploded their first atomic weapon. The Western powers included
Please understand, Russia has always been a secret society. Just recently, we found out that the secret police had kept records on UFO phenomena, and some of them had been released only recently. Some, not all, coming to light now.
Case in point, the intriguing film footage we had acquired. Proof, some say, of alien visitation. Being that this material is of such sensational nature, we had many questions regarding its history. Little information was provided us by the black market dealer from whom the film was purchased. It is likely that such materials were kept stored in a holding facility, a vault located beneath KGB headquarters perhaps, reserved only for those with the highest level of security clearance. Kept safe in underground storage for decades, the film was probably only handled by a select few who would have known of its existence. After the collapse of the Soviet system, there was a transitional period marked by confusion. Accountability to the old regime dwindled, and closely guarded property lay vulnerable to the changes sweeping through the crumbling Union. Those with connections under the old regime found themselves perfectly positioned to exploit the situation.
There was a lot of chaos when the Soviet Union, disintegrated. In my opinion, at that time, it was very easy for an, agent with brains to get his hands on such files and sell them here.
So it would be conceivable that documentation might be obtainable through similar sources to provide authentication of the film. Though most leads proved to be ultimately unproductive, we found that with perseverance, money, and a bit of luck, it is possible to acquire classified Soviet documents. Using a hidden camera, we recorded numerous meetings over a period of months in which we attempted to obtain relevant materials. This former agent was able to confirm interest not only in the 1968 crash near Berezovsky, but in other Soviet attempts to recover UFO documentation and technology.
Ever since Stalin had been in control of the Soviet Union, especially in the post-World War II years, he was determined that if there were any
If the Russians had in fact recovered an extraterrestrial vehicle, as they seem to be doing in this footage, they no doubt would have wanted to benefit from its technology. We invited ufologist Stanton Friedman to view the recovered footage and to give us his input.
It would not be surprising if saucers had crashed in the Soviet Union. And if somebody had monitored this on radar from whenever, satellites, we had satellites, they had satellites at that time, or just a report from a local person. And the kicker is, the fact that you get troops out there and a cameraman doesn't necessarily mean it's a flying saucer. We need to be a little cautious about jumping to conclusions. Now, I think that film is worth a detailed investigation. Those things cost a lot of money, actually, to go over it. You have different specialists looking at, are the uniforms correct for the time frame? Is the film actually made in the Soviet Union?
We asked Russian film expert Sergei Goncharov to examine the film for its authenticity. He first explained the background of the film cans.
And this is the name of the factory that manufactures the motion picture film in the city of Pereslavl. This is the type of film type A2, which is the emulsion.
After Sergei examined the cans, he felt that they were authentic and consistent with the area and time period from which they had allegedly come.
Now that we've looked at the cans, the next thing to do was to actually find out if the film itself had any markings on it. Okay, in the very beginning of the film, we have this word, which in Russian says начало, or the beginning, or the start. Now, the next bit of information are these two items. M-A-R-T, Mart, which is the month of March, 1969, letter G for year. So the year of 1969, the month of March. Okay, then we have the two bits of information which says plyonka number 267. Plyonka in Russian means emulsion or film, could denote the reel, the roll, or a batch, and this, of course, is the number. The next thing we see is this bit of information. Совершенно секретно, top secret archive of the KGB logo and the word archive of the KGB.
Finally, Sergei Goncharov compared the markings on the film itself to what was printed on the cans.
As you notice right here on the edge of the negative, we have the word безопасная пленка, meaning safety film, and type A2, or type A2, which is exactly the information that you have on a can.
Next, we showed the film to Russian researcher Paul Stonehill.
The colors of the film, the quality, soldier uniforms. Somebody would have to go into special, to make a special effort to make a film that feels like something that was made in 1960s. I've seen a lot of films made in the 1960s, and this film here is almost of the same quality. It's not a 1980s or 1990s film. The KGB officer that had been looking and touching things looks quite genuine. To me, my gut feeling is this is not something that they had made intentionally to fool people.
UFO researcher Antonio Huneeus offered us his views on the film.
I would say that visually it's very impressive. The first thing that struck me was the good quality, a very, very, very clear footage. You see, of course, it wouldn't be possible to duplicate, you know, as a hoax. You would have to hire some actors and so on. But it was quite well done. Of course, it could even be some kind of disinformation too, that the KGB was quite notorious about doing disinformation. For what purpose, I don't know, but they might have done some kind of training film or something to, of course, if it was disinformation aimed against the Americans or something, we never heard of it, so that's also dubious.
Finally, while Mr. Huneeus felt that the film required more investigation, he was impressed and intrigued by it.
Well, I would say that if this is real, and I do not have the elements to make that judgment, this is so far the best footage of an alleged crash UFO or a dead alien that I've seen so far.
Coming up next.
Let me tell you, this does not look like a spleen, and it doesn't look like any other organ that I have ever seen.
When we return right after this. Things not from this earth. This footage, which seems to depict Russian pathologists dissecting what appears to be a non-human life form, requires further analysis. We once again asked Stanton Friedman for his comments.
I don't know what to make out of it. I'd certainly say it's worth further investigation. By my standards, it's in my gray basket. Not black, not white, maybe. Worth following up on.
We then asked film expert Sergei Goncharov if he thought that the film's characteristics on this reel were consistent with the time period from which it was supposedly shot.
It certainly is consistent with the information on the can. It is negative. It's got the negative perforations. It's exactly what the information on the can indicated.
Sergei explains the significance of a flash frame, an interesting and possibly important characteristic of the film that was discovered.
All right, now, a flash frame, this is, of course, a flash frame is that piece of film that is, when you push the button on the camera and you start exposure and you stop the camera to stop the exposure, and then you restart the camera again, by virtue of inertia, the camera will sometimes expose either a flash of light, or if you point the camera away from the person in front of it, you will see some other subject matter. Those flash frames appear between the takes and sometimes show things and people that are not part of the scene itself. You have people that have nothing to do with the information that you've seen on a film before or after. Again, an individual in uniform. You see these people performing a procedure. You have somebody in civilian clothes, people that you have not seen before, as this is in a flash frame segment, which was not meant to be as the procedure that was being photographed.
Mr. Goncharov concludes that while the film's stock and camera techniques are consistent with KGB and Soviet government films of that period, he feels that the discrepancies with the subject matter require closer scrutiny.
Anytime you have subject matter of this type, any additional investigation is worthwhile. Absolutely.
Stanton Friedman was further intrigued by the medical techniques in the film.
I don't know what to make of these guys with what seem to be medical instruments, certainly in a medical facility, judging by the stuff on the wall. And it's interesting that you can see their faces, which is interesting from two different directions. You can tell their identity if you could find people that look like that. And they're apparently not afraid of contamination, ingesting anything toxic. Now, that could be that they'd already gone through this routine and somebody had said, hey, there's nothing bad here.
We then showed the film to Dr. Annette Ryan, a former lieutenant colonel with the Army Institute of Pathology.
The first thing that I notice is the way the doctors are dressed. They're dressed in these pristine white lab coats, and I think it would be more common for them to be dressed in scrubs or even butcher aprons, unless, of course, they know that they're being filmed and they want to look good. They also look very young, but that is consistent with forensic examinations, and that's because senior medical staff usually don't get involved in this type of procedure. I also noticed that they're wearing rubber gloves, but they're not wearing any other protective gear. They're not wearing goggles, they're not wearing masks, they're certainly not wearing any biohazard suits. I would assume that's because they're not concerned with contamination. And this, of course, is typical of Russian-Soviet medicine. I mean, when we think of Chernobyl, just remember back that there was a terrible lapse in any type of protection. It certainly would not happen in the United States. I mean, it would be unheard of.
Next, Dr. Ryan commented on some of the specific medical procedures.
All right, what's happening here is that they're using dissecting scissors to open up the sternum, which is a common procedure at that time. He's using the proper tool. The way they're holding and using the various tools looks correct, which indicates to me these people know what they're doing. I would say there's little doubt that these are actual Russian medical people. Now, if you look closely at this procedure here, which is repeated several times in this footage, what they're doing is removing a piece of material. The one doctor refers to it as an organ or resembling an organ. Then the diener sniffs off a small sample which is placed in a specimen jar for later analysis. Well, that's exactly what would be done in a forensic case or in the case of scientific research, for instance, if some new species had been discovered. They would remove very small pieces for later chemical and microscopic examination. The lead doctor also mentions a structure he describes as resembling ribs. And here you can see what indeed resembles a rib cage, as if this was the torso of some anthropoid or human-like organism.
Finally, though Dr. Ryan was unable to identify the subject matter, she believes that the techniques were consistent with those practiced in the Soviet Union during the late 1960s. We have little information about the specimen seen here, other than the pathologist's description and the KGB code name, Sverdlovsk midget. We wondered, though, how such a being might appear had it been recovered intact. Using only the images recorded on this film and the scant data available, technicians have constructed this 3D computer-generated model. Thus, with a bit of imagination and some forensic speculation, we have recreated what may have been the Soviets' possession of an actual being from another world. This incredible footage depicts members of the Soviet armed forces and what are believed to be 2 KGB agents inspecting and recovering a crashed flying saucer. Russian author Veniamin Vereshchagin has an idea of the final outcome of this operation.
Насколько мне известно, обломки аппарата.
As far as I know, the debris and their organic parts were taken to Mytishi,
где предположительно были сделаны,
where the apparatus was disassembled, analyzed,
аппарата,
and then back engineered.
Неизвестно, что произошло с органическими
As
останками.
for organic parts,
Но я имею сведения о том, что они были перевезены в дальнейшем
I heard they were taken to Moscow.
для изучения. Но что
What
было
happened
после этого,
afterwards, I don't really know.
His story seems to be backed up in part by one of the people who claims to have been involved in the operation back in 1969. But we found ex-KGB staffer Pavel Alexandrovich Klimchenkov living in seclusion in the Bryansk region of central Russia. He remembers the strange wreckage found in Beryozovsky.
At first, everyone believed that those debris were parts of some novelty aircraft manufactured in the United States or England. But having done some measuring and material analysis, we came to the conclusion that none of the domestic or foreign manufacturers known to us could have produced these apparatus, at least not in the conditions existing on this planet.
И вот тогда поступил приказ из Москвы.
It was then that an order came to transport the debris to the base in Mytishi near Moscow. Together with several other officers, I was assigned to provide safety and security to these materials during their transportation.
In attempting to verify the authenticity of this evidence, we have had the footage and the film itself examined by several experts. We also carefully studied the documents we had procured, which lent further credibility to what we had been told. Among the most telling was this top-secret KGB report specifically referring to Operation Sverdlovsk Midget and describing in detail the recovery operation at Beryozevsky. This document mentions the crashed disc, the organic remains, and the filming itself. There was also this secret order from the Soviet Ministry of Defense requesting assistance from military unit 67527. We looked closely at such elements of the footage as the uniforms and the arm patches worn by the soldiers. These patches seem consistent with the patch worn by such Soviet Army air defense companies as military unit 67527.
They're all wearing winter coats, which don't appear to have much in the way of insignia on them. And that is not out of character for the winter coats. They would generally not contain much in the way of identification. These are all members of the same unit. I can see that the weapons are AK-type weapons. The main battle weapon of the Russian army, even up through today's date, is the automatic Kalashnikov weapon. Yeah, it's clearly an AK, fixed stock, birch stock, no muzzle brake, milled receiver, no question about it. It also seems to be consistent with the muzzles of the weapons that I can see in this film.
In addition, we had notes from the scientific examination of the recovered organic specimen, which seemed consistent with the soundtrack of the dissection footage. With so many elements in seeming consistency, Vereshchagin's story becomes even more tantalizing and perplexing at the same time. Is it possible the Russians actually recovered an alien craft and its occupant 3 decades ago?